الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. أما بعد، فقد قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم: طلب العلم فريضة على كل مسلم ألا إن الله يحب بغاة العلم. Dear brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum again to all of you. Thank you all for joining us. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the subject of my talk is a little bit, say, theoretical, but there are very practical elements to it. And so, inshallah, we can explore both the theoretical and the practical, both the scholastic, but also the real effects of this issue of modern knowledge and what we really understand about knowledge and science. So, inshallah, in the next few moments, the few minutes that we have together, I will be mainly touching on three things. First is how we understand, how we define knowledge in our contemporary world. And this has some philosophical aspects to it, but also even just in our daily lives, right? So what are the fields that we pursue at college, at university, and what are the careers that we, say, for example, suggest or impose, depending on your family, on your children, right? What are those pursuits that you have? But ultimately, I think our definition of knowledge really also defines for us and tells us our relationship to our religion. This very important hadith that has been it's one of the mutawatir ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa where our religion, our tradition, our entire civilization of Islam is based on the pursuit of knowledge. And so if we really want to understand who we are and what are our hopes and our dreams in life, what are our aspirations as Muslims, we really have to contemplate what our definition of knowledge is and what we can understand from the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt and of Allah in the Quran. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is what effect that definition of knowledge has on our approach to our lives, the way that we sort of plot our lives, the way we proceed our lives, and the lives of those who we hold dear. And then finally, the aim and the pursuit of that aim of knowledge. So why do we learn, right? Why do we engage in scholarship? Why are we concerned about knowledge? And what are we trying to get out of it? And I think, especially for us Muslims, again, this is an important topic because a lot of times we talk about ilm. Talabul ilm faridatun ala kulli Muslim. Or in other ahadith, in other reports, Rasulullah is reported to have said, Talabul ilm faridatun. Talabul ilm faridatun, and you have to, go and search and seek knowledge, right? We've heard all of this hadith. Sometimes it says, ala kulli Muslim wa Muslima, man and woman, or walau bisin. So you have to even go to the farthest extent that you could possibly imagine at that time would have been China. It is a fundamental and foundational aspect of the teachings of the Prophet. Again, it's not to a particular school. And in fact, if we look in the history of Islamic civilization, this is one of the defining elements that you would have scholars, hadith, fiqh, kalam, falsafa, different scholars going and seeking knowledge, and scholarship becoming the highest achievement that a person could attain. knowledge, this pursuit of knowledge, and the books and the memorization of that knowledge becomes a part of Islamic civilization. It becomes the defining feature of that civilization. We all talk about the golden period of the Islamic civilization. And that golden period, on one level, is defined by the amount of scholarship that the Muslims could translate from other civilizations, and as well could develop within their own civilization. Some of the very basic examples that we can think of is, for example, philosophy, medicine, right? The great people that we think about in terms of the people who developed Islamic civilization. Ibn Sina, a person who was a master of philosophy and as well medicine. And these are traditions that they cultivate, but also that they translate from other civilizations, from the Greek, from the Indian, from the Persian, and they are willing to accept that scholarship and develop it as something that is integral and that is native to the Islamic religion and tradition. So when Ibn Sina or the philosophers or even the mutakallimun, they take certain principles from other traditions, it's not as though that they are now reformulating something that is foreign, right? We have even some traditions that say that, for example, a piece of knowledge, it's almost like a lost possession of the Muslim. And so, again, we have to think about this topic as a way for us to understand ourselves. That is all very good and well. Yes, we have this memory of what our civilization developed, and we come to today. Today, the way that we perceive knowledge, and in not just regular sort of religious knowledge, but the way that we perceive knowledge in general is defined by the society and the civilization that we live in. One of the most sort of important aspects of the modern world, and I want to use this in a very broad way, not in a technical way, but in the modern world, is that a lot of the ideas, a lot of the concepts, a lot of the ways of living and being that we are surrounded by, sometimes we try to distance ourselves from them. We say, we're not Christian, we're Muslim, so we don't eat pork. We are Muslim, so we try to establish a healthy and loving family, right? We get married, we have children, and so on and so forth. But one thing that we sometimes sort of are ignorant of are how much our society affects us. There's this idea among sociologists that is called the idea of reflexivity. So for example, take statistics on marriage. I believe we had a session on marriage yesterday. You take the statistics on marriage. Who has a positive opinion about the success of marriage for, say, for example, their community? Not your own family, I don't want to get into that. Not, say, for example, for yourself, but who has a positive opinion, and you can raise your hand, about the success rate of, say, marriage in your community? Okay, so we have 2, 3, 4. Why do we have, for those who didn't raise their hand, why do you have maybe a pessimistic or a bad outlook about marriage? And this is just one institution, right? Why do we have a bad outlook about marriage in our communities? One of those reasons, and it could be a vast number of reasons, one of those reasons is because we look at statistics. So statistics, when I see, for example, I read the statistics and it tells me that 50% of marriages end up in divorce, or even worse, right? And this isn't just for, non-Muslim families, but even for Muslim families. When I look at those statistics, what type of effect does that have on my own perception of the health and the well-being of marriage? That is called, very basically, that's called reflexivity. So statistics has an effect on the way that I live my life. And that statistics could be drawn from Muslim families, it could be drawn from non-Muslim families, it could be drawn from a whole set of things. But ultimately, it will have an effect on the way I live my life, the perception that I have about the success, the future success, or failure of my own family. So when we think about the modern world, when we think about our place in a larger culture, in a larger society, and especially in a larger civilization, we have to think about the effect that that larger society has on me and the community that I am a part of. That is where modern knowledge, and this idea of modern knowledge, becomes important. Because we are not the ones who are defining knowledge for us and for our children. When my child goes to college or goes to school, high school, and elementary school, they are getting a training in a particular type of, or a definition of knowledge that might not be familiar to me. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. I apologize. All right. One of the main, let's say, characteristics. Sallu ala Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
I apologize. I hope I can make it through it. If not, that's okay. Thank you. Sorry. I'll try to speak lower so that I can keep my voice. All right. And that's a gift from God to all of you as well. So we can send another loud salawat. All right. So one of the basic characteristics of the way that we look at the world, the way that we try to understand and study the world as people who live in sort of modern life, is that we a lot of times separate and distinguish between facts about the world and values. And this is something that maybe some of you are familiar with. And I'm going to just very quickly mention this because it does get a little bit theoretical, but also because we can maybe, if it's not clear, then we can talk about it in the question and answer section. So, oh, thank you. That's very kind. Thank you. All right, I hope that'll help. That the world is basically certain physical objects or certain mental objects that we have to go and now discover through some sort of scientific method, right? So for example, you know, if we want to understand an animal that we have newly discovered, we will go and dissect that animal. First, we have to kill it, and then we go and dissect that animal and we see what types of organs that animal has. And once we have understood the animal, then we come to, say, a religious tradition, an ethical tradition, and then we say, okay, well, this is how I'm supposed to relate to this newly discovered animal, right? In other words, my relationship to the world is not a relationship primarily based on my responsibility to the world, but I first have to know the world around me. I first have to go and discover the objects in that world, chairs, tables, people, animals, plants, and so on. And then I bring a separate outside tradition or system of thinking that tells me now, how do I interact with this thing, this newly discovered object that I see in front of me? And so, a lot of times people will say, for example, I know certain facts about the the world out there. Or, for example, you will talk about history, right? I know certain facts about the events of history, material facts, and then I can decide whether Yazid, for example, was a bad person, whether he was a good person, whether Imam Hussein was in the right or not, right? I understand the facts on the ground, and then I bring my external ethical system, Islam, Christianity, whatever it might be, to now understand those facts. And this is a very modern and a very recent way of looking at the world. When we think about, for example, the Islamic principle, we don't just say, you are all individual human beings, and this world is, for example, a world that now I have to go and dissect, I have to kill, I have to dissect it, and then I have to discover what's inside of it, the material things within it. But primarily, as Muslims, our tradition teaches us that we are thinking about the world as a creation of God. A person who thinks about the world as a creation of God is not saying that I don't have to discover how God created his world. But he is saying that my values, my religious tradition, defines the way that I interact with the world from the very beginning, before I even go and start to discover it. It brings the primary focus is my responsibility towards the world and not separate from discovering the world in the way that it is. So I will give you a very short quote. A prominent philosopher by the name of Reichenbach, he's German, he says, the modern analysis of knowledge makes a cognitive an ethical way of looking at the world, an ethical system. It makes it impossible. The modern analysis of knowledge, the modern way that we know the world and we discover the world, makes a cognitive ethics, an ethical system, impossible. Knowledge, and this is the more the more important points, knowledge does not include any normative, any value specific parts, and therefore does not lend itself to an interpretation of ethics. In other words, when we discover something about the world, it doesn't necessarily tell us, that thing does not tell us now what responsibility I have. I have to bring something externally to bear. This is one way of understanding scholarship and knowledge in our society and in the modern world. Another way, and in response to this, there is an opposite philosophy, and that is generally what sometimes is called existentialism. The idea is, and this is, again, very broad strokes, and I don't mean to by explaining it, deform these ideas, but in very broad strokes, the idea is that I, or human beings, have certain knowledge about the world, or let's say certain feelings about the world. There is a self, and that self can now create realities within itself or outside of itself. For example, and this also actually goes to the source of religion as something that is worthy of believing in or worthy of study. A very prominent, again, philosopher, thinker, author by the name of William James. He says, feeling is the deeper source of religion, and philosophical and theological formulas are secondary products, like translations of a text into another tongue. In other words, the way that I interact with the world is not in terms of the discoveries of science, not in terms of the facts that are there that I have to now go and investigate. Thank you. But rather, they are about my feelings. And this is something that, again, that has a direct repercussion on the way that, in some of these social issues that we face in our day. For example, when somebody tells you that this issue of gender identity and gender rights, right? We are the basic idea, and again, this is there's a lot of different theories and stuff about that. I don't want to get into it in too much detail, but the basic idea is that my sense of who I am, my sense of myself is not just determined by certain social requirements, but I have a say about the very basic identity and the very basic ways that I can define who I am as a human being, whether that is in terms of what religion I choose, what family I'm a part of, and even what gender I have. If gender is a social construct, then insofar as it's a social construct, then it can also be an identity that I choose and that I can change that construct based on what feels appropriate to me and my feelings. Now, we have these two conflicting ways of looking at knowledge. When we look at the Quran on the third level, we see that the Quran sees knowledge not necessarily as understanding facts about the world, even facts about Islam, even facts about the Quran. That's not how the Quran understands what true knowledge is. Nor is it what I understand in terms of the feelings that I have or the sense of self that I have, the things that are internal to me or the things that I have control over. But rather, the Quran defines knowledge, or it gives us a sense of knowledge. It never says ilm is such and such. But from what we can gather from the Quran is that there is a very strong sense between the revelation that God has given to us, that has revealed to us, and the knowledge that the prophets are supposed to be spreading amongst human beings. So in Surah Al-Baqarah, and I'll mention just a few verses. In Surah Al-Baqarah, we do dua. رَبَّنَا وَابْعَثْ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِكَ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. All right? In this ayah, it's a dua. O our Lord, send to them a prophet from amongst themselves who will recite for them your verses. وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ, and will teach them the book. So one characteristic of knowledge in the Quran is a teaching of the book of God, a book of revelation that is not separate from the way that we interact with the world. And in fact, this book of God defines for us what this world is actually created based upon. One of the very basic ways that Muslims in Islamic civilization have dealt with the world is in terms of this dual idea. On the one hand, you have Kitab al-Tashri'. On the other hand, you have Kitab al-Takween. Kitab al-Tashri' is the Quran and the Ahadith, a book that you can read, a text that you gaze upon, that you contemplate, that you spend your entire life studying and contemplating. And so ulama, the scholarly tradition in Islam, is a textual tradition. It's a tradition that is based on reading and spending your lives deciphering texts. It's not about necessarily going out into the field and maybe taking specimens of the world, right? It's a very textual tradition. I'm not saying taking specimens is bad. I'm just saying that's how Muslims have understood the ayat of the Quran. يُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابِ, the Quran says, send them a messenger who will teach them the book, وَالْحِكْمَةِ. So teaching is combined with wisdom. Teaching is on the one hand of a book that God has revealed, but as well is presented with a particular wisdom, وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ. And then this wisdom also, this teaching also is purifying of the soul. إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. We said there is this idea in Islamic civilization between Kitab al-Takween and Kitab al-Tashri', this kind of juxtaposition between the created world and the world of a book. And this is a very prominent idea. Unfortunately, because we don't have much time, I don't want to get into too much detail, but the idea is that the way that for example, my reading of the Quran, my reading of the ahadith gives me a better sense of the world as it is in the external world as it is. So for me to now discover how God has created his creation requires me to go and reference those books. Ilm, in other words, in Islam, is not just going out and discovering something out there, but it's coupled with discovering something within. And discovering something within allows me to discover the basic principles upon which Allah has created his creation. That's the first thing. The second point I want to mention from the Quran is that the Quran defines for us and it explains to us knowledge, not something that is necessarily separated from Allah. Rather, it is something that is God-given. It's something that God imbues in the hearts and the souls of human beings. And of course, the very famous ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا ثُمَّ عَرَضَهُمْ عَلَى الْمَلَائِكَةِ فَقَالَ أَنْبِئُونِي بِأَسْمَاءِ هَؤُلَاءِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Allah is the one who reveals to Nabi Adam. And he teaches Nabi Adam. So how does this change our perception of knowledge? When Allah is the one who is revealing that knowledge, it's not something that I can now disregard. You know certain facts about the world, I can disregard those facts. But if Allah is the one who is teaching me and revealing that knowledge to me, I can't say now that I can disregard those facts in the same way. Is that clear? So I, for example, don't know the history of America in the same way the facts, the certain facts, for example, who was the fourth president of the United States. These are certain facts. But then if we think about knowledge as an entire scheme, as a system that is revealed by Allah, then knowledge becomes something much more sacred, something much more important, that now I have a responsibility towards. All right. We have, unfortunately we don't have time, so I won't get into some of the other ahadith. That is one aspect. The first is defining what knowledge means and how this journey of understanding God's creation and the created world, the external Kitab al-Takween relates to Kitab al-Tashri', the world within and the world that is legislated and revealed by Allah. That is the basic pillars of Islamic knowledge. And that is juxtaposed to some of the ways that we understand modern knowledge. One effect, and this is hopefully an important effect that we can sort of contemplate on and maybe we can discuss in the question and answer. One effect of objectivizing, of making knowledge about certain objects in the world that are separate from me, and that are not related to any responsibility that I have towards them, is that usually, and we kind of experience this for those who are in college and for those who go and study in the university, is that we don't really care too much to have a different disposition towards that knowledge. And what do I mean by that? In other words, the way that I'm convinced of certain facts is by you bringing certain evidence towards me or certain proofs, certain arguments. And if those arguments are objective and they're neutral and they're valid in my mind, then I will accept them. If they're not objective and they're not neutral, then I won't accept them. What do I mean by this? So for example, if a person says, this is why I believe in Islam. Because the Prophet has come and he has given a particular tradition, and I have read the life of the Prophet and I accept the ahadith of Rasulullah, for example. A person will say, well, I can look at those same ahadith and I don't get the same amount of inspiration that you get. I don't feel my soul shifting or my soul yearning to learn more about this person. Yes, you might believe certain things and I believe different things. I have a different disposition and you have a different disposition. There's no connection, in other words, between my mind and the facts that I know and my heart. And this becomes particularly important when we are talking about even our own religious tradition. When, for example, we are trying to learn about the history of Islam, right? A lot of times in university setting, you learn a very sort of neutral and objective history. For people who are in university, you'll usually be told that, for example, theology, your own theological positions have no place in the conversation. And that might be good just in terms of teaching principles, in the sense that you don't want to constantly be just presenting your own idea. You want to have a large breadth of ideas that you are exposed to. But ultimately, our relationship to knowledge should not just be about certain things that I know, but it should ultimately be affecting my heart. And if I don't accept something, or if I, for example, aren't moved by certain words of the Quran or of the ahadith, or just that knowledge becomes something that is placed in my mind, then maybe there is something wrong with me. And this is, unfortunately, one of the main ways that we interact with knowledge in our modern world. So we become, when we can choose, for example, to go into different fields. And we might encourage our children to go into technical fields because that will bring you some level of success. But then we don't think about, well, what effect does that field have on my soul? What effect will it have on the trajectory of my life and the rest of my community? Or, for example, if I attend an event, a conference, and I go to multiple sessions, and I just feel like I've learned a lot, but I haven't really moved my soul, then maybe I haven't actually learned anything, and I have regressed in a certain way. And so I will mention a hadith, because the idea is to juxtapose modern knowledge versus the knowledge that we have from the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. The Ahlul Bayt, they define religious knowledge and knowledge in general, true scholarship, in terms of that thing which compels you to act, which does not separate your understanding of the world from your responsibility towards it. In one hadith, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, he says, Allah will not accept an action except through understanding, or except with understanding. And He will not accept an understanding except that it is also coupled with action. So whoever knows and has ma'rifah, that ma'rifah will force him and compel him to act. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَعْمَلْ فَلَا مَعْرِفَةَ لَهُ. Whoever does not act on that, then he doesn't actually have knowledge. And some philosophers talk about this when we talk about, for example, religious arguments, right? A lot of times we say, for example, why do we believe in God? And we might present an argument to someone, right? Cosmological argument, ontological argument, or whatever other argument you might come up with. And you see that, the person hears it, and something is very convincing to you, but it just doesn't convince that other person. And you might ask yourself, well, why is this not convincing this other person? Why is this person sort of shut off from these, from this sort of arguments, this proof that I have laid out for this person? And you might think, well, sometimes maybe because my argument isn't good enough. But then, according to, again, some philosophers, they say that actually religious arguments and generally arguments that we are presented with throughout our lives, a lot of times these are person relative. So depending on how much knowledge I have, background information I have about that particular topic, depending on how much experience I have in that field, a particular argument will be convincing or will not be convincing based on that experience, that background knowledge. So for example, a doctor will come and present a proof to me, an argument for why I should take this medicine. It just does not make sense to me, right? This is a very basic level. But then if you present it to another physician, it will make sense to them. On a very basic level though, if my heart and my disposition is not such that I am willing to accept something that is beyond the material world, something that I can't necessarily see or I can't necessarily touch, then my disposition, my heart, is going to take me away from any type of religious argument, logical argument that I might be presented with. So that's the second thing. The effect of a knowledge that is purely about scientific facts or facts about the world, it also changes the way my heart is disposed towards those truths, those higher spiritual or metaphysical truths, and it actually can cut me off from the most convincing arguments that would move another person. This relationship between my mind and my soul, my knowledge and my heart, and then through my heart, my actions. If you want to convince, for example, and this is one last thing that I will mention on this point, and then I'll move on. If you want to convince someone, for example, that honesty is good, what are the types of things do you have to tell them to prove to them that honesty is something that's going to bring meaning to your life? How can you prove that to them? One of the best ways to prove it is by saying, be honest. Take on this virtue. Go and help other people, for example. Be compassionate. The experience of being compassionate opens up my heart, it opens up my soul, and it gets me into a habit of just that basic level of convincing comes from that direct experience. And the more I do it, the more I become convinced. And this is the case with many of the virtues that we have, whether it's honesty, integrity, courage, things that you might not be able to convince another person of, but so long as they are not predisposed to them. The final thing, and inshallah I will end with this and then we can open it up. The aim of knowledge and the sort of the ultimate goals of knowledge. I've mentioned a few sort of Western modern philosophers, primarily because these are the people who define for us the way that we view the world. I'll mention one last one and then I will be done. There's a very famous philosopher by the name of Francis Bacon. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He was a person in the 16th and 17th century. And he is considered to be the father of science or scientific empiricism, the scientific method and so on. And the idea, some of the main contributions that he has made for our modern world is, I will just mention two. First is this idea of progress. When we look in the ahadith of, for example, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there is one hadith in particular that I'd like to mention here. And that is that one day Rasulullah, he goes into the masjid. Maybe some of you have heard of this hadith before. And he says that, he sits in the masjid and he sees that there are people who are surrounding one individual. And they say that, the Prophet asks, who is this person? And they say that this is an allama. Then he asks, well, what is an allama? What is a very scholarly person? And they respond, he says, the people say, this is person who is a'lamun nas bi ansabil Arab, the most knowledgeable person of the genealogy of the Arabs. And then the Prophet says, this type of knowledge doesn't really benefit anyone, whether they know it or they don't. Then he gives this definition. إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ ثَلَاثَةٌ آيَةٌ مُحْكَمَةٌ أَوْ فَرِيضَةٌ عَادِلَةٌ أَوْ سُنَّةٌ قَائِمَةٌ وَمَا خَلَاهُنَّ فَهُوَ فَضْلٌ. Knowledge is of three kinds. Either it is an ayah muhkama, an established ayah of Allah, verse or sign of Allah, أَوْ فَرِيضَةٌ عَادِلَةٌ, or a deeply held sort of responsibility and action that people are compelled to do, أَوْ سُنَّةٌ قَائِمَةٌ, or a widely established, a widely accepted sunnah, tradition that people engage in. Anything other than that is simply a virtue that some people might have. One of the sort of the insights that we get from this hadith is that ayah muhkama, is that something that develops on itself? No, it's something that reveals or that God has created in the past, and then maybe I have discovered it. Farida adila, it's also not something that builds on itself. It's something that is known and then that is established. Or sunnatun qa'ima, a tradition that is widely held, that is established based on what is good. These are not things that are based on an idea of progress. One of the very basic characteristics of our modern way of living and of thinking is this idea of progress. That the more we live, the more we continue in this world, the more we can discover about the world. And that knowledge builds on itself. Stuff that our parents, for example, didn't know. And as science continues, as scientific discoveries are made, this increase in knowledge also continues. In other words, our future is more sort of optimistic than our past. Our parents didn't know certain things, their parents didn't know things that they knew, and then we are going to know certain things that our parents didn't even know. This idea begins with a person by the name of Francis Bacon. So he says, it is said, many shall pass to and fro, and science shall be increased, as if the opening of the world by navigation and commerce and the further discovery of knowledge should meet in one time or age. In other words, it's not something that we look for in the past that our ancestors or our scholars had perfected, but it's something that we have to constantly be in search of. Another effect of the work and the thought of Bacon is not just that we are developing knowledge and we learn more as we go along, but that the ultimate aim of knowledge is not for me to become a more virtuous person, for me to know about the world, even for me to know about the world. But it is, what can I do with that knowledge? What are the benefits, the actual physical, material benefits of my learning, say in my learning a particular science? So, before Bacon, the idea was that I would come to learn about the world so that I can become a more complete and a fuller human being. With Bacon, it becomes, I learn about the world, I learn about the forms, for example, the forms of different animals, or I learn about the environment, different parts of the natural world, so that I can do something with that knowledge. I can detect and bring to light things never yet done, and achieve both truth in speculation and freedom in operation. In other words, if I'm learning something purely theoretical, according to one field, one way of dealing with knowledge, that's not enough. I have to have a practical application of that knowledge for that knowledge to be something that is beneficial and that is fruitful. It's not about something that opens up my soul to the creation of Allah. It is something that allows me now to come and manipulate the creation of Allah. To go and, for example, impose my will upon the rest of His creation. This idea of knowledge is power apparently actually starts with Bacon himself, and then it gets developed by others later on, by Thomas Hobbes and so on. In contrast, Islamically, we don't see knowledge as being something that I can now use to manipulate the world and to increase in my own social standing. And I will just mention this one final hadith and then I will conclude. In a hadith of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, he says, "Inna al-ulama warathatul anbiya." The scholars are the heirs to the prophets. Scholars are heirs to the prophets. Why is that? Because the anbiya, the prophets, they did not leave as an inheritance money and wealth. Rather, they left their ahadith and their words and their teachings that now we can come and gather around and benefit from. And the point of benefiting from those ahadith is to connect ourselves to those teachings of the prophets, not to benefit from any sort of material or physical or financial way. But it is a furthering and an elaboration and a bringing to fruition the basic virtues that are placed within my soul.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.